Well, welcome everyone. I see we're still having people joining, and just welcome the ones who are already here. We're very lucky today to have this wonderful seminar speaker, Leo Figueira, who's joining us from Australia, 6:30 in the morning. So we're especially grateful for his attendance today. Leo is actually an alumni of Lehigh. We were just discussing before folks joined about his time at Lehigh and how things have changed since he came. And actually, when you graduated, Leo, is when I joined Lehigh. So it seems like the two of us have a continuous progression here. So Leo's in Australia, as I mentioned. He's the commercial director for Canadian Solar in Melbourne. He has over 20 years of experience in energy and renewables from the US, Europe, and Asia Pacific as well. Over the last 16 years, he's been in Australia looking at the transition in the country as it moves towards net zero, and that's what he'll be talking about today. He's a big contributor to regulatory rule changes and works with regulators and industry advocacy groups, which I think will bring a really great perspective to the discussion. So I'll turn this over to Leo. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Appreciate everyone being here and providing me the opportunity to talk a little bit about a big passion of mine, which is renewable energy and sustainability more broadly. Notwithstanding the 6:30 in the morning time slot, feel free to ask any questions. We'll try to work through the slides, but if anyone has any burning questions or if things are not clear, please feel free to jump in and clarify as we move forward here. So Australia is one of the world's leading commodity exporters, being a heavyweight in coal, metals, uranium, natural gas in the form of LNG, and all sorts of different commodities. On a per capita basis, Australia's emissions is actually quite a bit higher than even that of the US by quite a bit when you take exports into account. So whilst the US gets a lot of flack in the international community, it's actually Australia that's about 33% worse in per capita terms. With an abundance of natural resources, of course, came a desire to burn a lot of that coal locally to produce cheap, reliable, dispatchable baseload power supplies in the country. So if you sort of rewind even 5 years ago, but more salient about 10 years ago, the country was probably 90% coal-fired and 10% natural gas-fired, with very little in the form of renewables, other than in Tasmania, where things are pretty much 100% hydro, but Tasmania is a small place. So the big conundrum facing the country, as the cost of renewables plummeted relative to the marginal cost of burning fossil fuels, became, right, so how do we transition cost effectively without sacrificing two things? One is reliability and security of supplies, and two is without having the transition cost the end consumer an arm and a leg. So, so the transition really in Australia took off in the last 5 years, I'd say. And today, Australia is projected to be the #1 place in the world for decentralized energy being the proportion of end consumers that are served by non-grid scale renewable energy systems, such as rooftop solar, and small scale geothermal and wind energy resources. So today, really what we want to talk about is the key challenges, both technical from an engineering point of view, as well as financial and policy challenges that the country is tackling in order to go from where it is today to a 90% plus or even 100% renewable energy future. And towards the end, we'll pause and compare and contrast which of those lessons can be applied and extrapolated out to the US itself. Before getting into the bulk of it, I'll just provide you guys with a little bit more context around who we are, what we do, and what role we play in this transition. So Canadian Solar is a global, I think we're #2 in the world, integrated renewable energy company. We are present just about everywhere in the value chain of solar energy and now storage over the last 2 years as well, with offices in 23 different locations across the globe, and over 20,000 megawatts of capacity developed over the last several years. We are, we're on 5 continents. I'm based here in Melbourne. We have offices in Sydney, Adelaide, and Brisbane as well. And I do sometimes have the privilege of getting involved in broader Asia Pacific discussions, as well as discussions in California. We do tend to overlap with other offices quite a bit when it comes to global clients. So there is quite a bit of global cross-hybridization within the company. In Australia, we are probably the second biggest developer, with nearly 3,000 megawatts of solar in the pipeline and 2,000 megawatts of storage. As you can tell, we're predominantly focused on Eastern markets, with a couple of assets in Queensland, the bulk of our activities in New South Wales, quite a bit in Victoria as well, and a couple of assets in South Australia. Right, so getting into the bulk of the presentation now. Key challenge number 1 that we are faced here is matching resources with population centers. We'll talk a lot about this here towards the end of the presentation, but also throughout. So, I mean, one of the key challenges that Australia and the US, as we'll come to find out later in the presentation, have is distance. Maps don't really tend to do justice to the actual size of Australia. For you guys to have an example, Queensland here is 2.5 times the size of Texas. WA is 4.2 times the size of Texas. So there are some very, very big distances. And the population centers are basically down here on the seacoast. So Melbourne is here right on the water. Sydney is here right on the water. Brisbane is here right on the water. Adelaide is here. And with the exception of Adelaide, which is closer to high irradiation areas, high irradiation, solar irradiation areas being in the center of the country, the power stations of Olds that we talked about a couple of slides ago were actually built very, very close to the city centers. So the transmission network in the country really just served the generators, which were on the coast, and the population that was on the coast, with very little inland transmission infrastructure to speak of. So as solar decreased in price significantly, coupled with wind, here's a wind resource map on the right, and as you can see, the wind resource is also in the center of the country, with very little wind resource on the coastal areas. So the big question facing the market operator and policymakers alike is, one, who should bear the brunt of new transmission costs? Two, how do we look at the all-in costs of power generation in a net zero world? Clearly, it's not just the cost of building wind or building solar or building storage. It's the all-in cost of building those technologies alongside the cost of transmission expansion as well. So how do we go about spending billions of dollars in a way that makes sense to the end consumer and minimizes prices in the long run relative to the existing infrastructure that we have today? Key challenge number 2, and this is where we start to get into a little bit of engineering. And if there's any electrical engineers in the room, please feel free to chime in. as you see fit. I am not an engineer by way of introduction, but feel free to chime in. So looking at South Australia as an example, South Australia is relatively small, 1,600 megawatts in peak operational demand terms. It's at the very end of the grid on the left-hand side of the map. Here, the grid actually starts in Queensland, goes all the way down and ends here. Western Australia is on another grid. But looking at South Australia is actually at 134% renewables relative to its installed maximum demand capacity. So the time of day prices in South Australia often dip to significantly below zero. Prices are not shown here. We're just really showing operational demand. And demand drops to negative demand. So if you're a generator online, you're actually paying to generate as opposed to being paid. And if you're a load online, you're actually getting paid as opposed to a generator getting paid. So what that does is it yields a lot of market inefficiencies. No investment will come to a place where rather than getting paid for a new generation asset, you're actually having to pay out instead. And more importantly, system security, such as inertia and voltage, become at risk in a deeply renewable grid. Without synchronous generation online, it is extremely, extremely difficult from a system strength and inertia and voltage collapse avoidance to run a power grid. So how does one go about running a fully renewable power grid from a system security point of view? That's the other challenge we'll talk about a lot here today. So getting into the detail, this is a bird's eye view of how the market operator every year puts out a publication called the Integrated System Plan, which maps out actionable projects from the point of view of transmission, its latest view on the on announced retirements and modeled retirements for coal power plants, and its latest forecast of the growth of wind and solar, as well as storage as of late. So looking at the role of this previous graph here, if you were to map prices here on this graph, you would see prices being high in the off-peak hours, and during the solar peak day, prices would plummet, often into negative land, and then pick up again during evening rush hour. This is what we call the duck curve, and what the duck curve has done is basically kill non-flexible baseload generators. The thing about coal generators is that they are unable to turn down significantly enough to avoid negative prices. So if you're a coal-fired generator online in a place like California, where the duck curve does exist, in a place like Spain, or as of late Germany, and of course throughout Australia, you are actually running at a loss during solar peak hours, which is an incredible, incredible challenge to coal-fired operators. And by, as you can tell from this picture over here, announcements are starting to be made around the exit of coal. So renewables, by way of making coal generators having to run at a loss, are very, very slowly killing. Sorry, I think you guys can hear my dog in the background. Let me just close the door. Sorry. So solar and renewables more broadly are very, very slowly taking coal out of business. Now, whilst we all like to take coal out of business, let's bear in mind that coal is synchronous. Coal does provide inertia, and coal does provide voltage protection, whereas renewables mainly, and as a broad comment, do not. So there are some significant security challenges that this poses. We'll come back to that a little bit later on in the presentation. And in order to backfill the dearth of synchronous generation. What AEMO is predicting is an increase in grid scale solar and wind capacity approaching 140,000 megawatts. Now, you will notice that we have 20,000 megawatts retiring, 120,000 megawatts being built out. Clearly, there's an overbuild of renewables that's necessary in order to make up for the intermittent nature, non-dispatchability nature of renewables. So there is a 6x factor. Some would argue that's a lot of renewables to make up for 20 gigs of retirements. But in order to really have portfolio effects, you do need a locationally diversified fleet of solar and wind generators, coupled with, at least, a significant amount of dispatchable storage. Storage is not quite making up on a one-to-one basis for the capacity that's being lost in terms of co-generators, but getting up to about 75% of the lost capacity there. So the roadmap really is coal comes offline. It is no longer economically feasible to run an inflexible coal-fired power station fleet in the country, which in turns opens up capacity for utility scale solar and wind, which can then be coupled with storage to make dispatchability and system of security less of a concern. Now, a topic we haven't really covered here in the presentation is inertia and system strength in great detail because of the technical nature of the topic. But what we are seeing is that inverter-based technologies can be grid forming and respond to signals from the grid by mimicking the voltage on the grid in much in the same way that a synchronous power plant can be online synchronized to the power grid, so can an inverter. So what we're seeing here is a lot of trials of grid forming inverters that mimic the way that a synchronous power plant is aligned. So the thinking here really is that the growth in synchronous grid forming inverters will, alongside storage, make up for the system security shortfalls by the vacating coal power fleet in Australia. So we now talk a little bit about policy, and probably without wishing to remark about one's politics, there's always been a lot of talk about whether the green transformation is a thing of the right or a thing of the left, and there's a lot of protection, potential protection from certain political parties around keeping jobs, such as coal jobs, versus focusing on clean energy jobs in the transition. This slide really goes to the heart of the same discussion that exists in the States also exists here. So I think both sides of the aisle have now come to the conclusion that despite one side not supporting green energy policies whatsoever in any way, shape, or form, that the transition is inevitable. And now both sides of the aisle here in Australia, at least, have come to realize that the threat needs to be turned into an opportunity. And I think this slide here from AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator, speaks volumes around what the country is trying to do with its cheap renewables and abundant natural resources. So the country is really trying to reinvent itself as a hydrogen export powerhouse. So hydrogen can be used in a whole lot of use cases to clean natural gas, for instance, natural gas pipelines can withstand about 10 to 20% clean hydrogen, for ammonia. There's also for heavy vehicles, there's a whole lot of use cases in Australia that are becoming increasingly more reliant on hydrogen. So clean hydrogen is probably the #1 emerging industry in Australia that's coming to be as a result of the clean renewable energy transition. So whilst the market operator is backing a step change regime as the base case, the most credible way that the transformation is going to play out, hydrogen superpower is a scenario where a significant proportion of politicians and industry and business leaders are going for. Hydrogen, to give you guys an example, the hydrogen industry, to give you guys an example, can in Australia create upwards of 150,000 jobs, which for a country of 20 million is actually a pretty big number. It's equivalent to creating 1.7 million jobs in the state. So it's a pretty big potential emerging industry coming about solely as a result of the clean renewable energy revolution. But just coming back to a couple of slides ago and talking about demand here, what hydrogen electrolysis, the production of hydrogen is undertaken via hydrogen electrolysis. Hydrogen electrolysis, like Bitcoin mining, is incredibly energy intensive. So if you come back to a couple of slides ago, when we talked about why is there a 6x increase in solar and wind relative to only 20 gigs of capacity being retired, well, it's because we are seeing a significant amount of additional load of electrification coming about, yes, as a result of EVs being on the grid, but mainly as a result of hydrogen electrolysis for domestic use and for export. So yeah, so the nuts and bolts really is we can become a clean hydrogen driven economy. We can use our abundant natural resources to create an industry from scratch. And like Australia is #1 in LNG in the world and coal exports and so forth, we can also be #1 in the world in hydrogen exports. We talked a little bit about the challenges of bringing faraway generation to the load centers. And this slide here really just goes, doesn't really do justice to the amount of public works that's being undertaken, but does provide a pretty good illustration of how things are being brought together through additional investments. There's 16, well, let me do this in miles. There's about 13,000 miles of new transmission lines that are being built at a cost of around $30 billion over the next 10 years or so. These transmission investments will clearly also create a whole raft of new jobs over the coming decade, tens of thousands of jobs, of reasonably high paying jobs. And what this transmissions public works will do is create renewable energy zones. Renewable energy zones are an attempt by governments and the market operator to orchestrate and organize previously disorderly developments of renewable energy. So the access regime for renewable developers like myself in the future will not be fully open access, whereby you ring up the market operator, you undertake a connection study, you join the queue, you pay your fees, and you wait for interconnection. In the way public policy gets done in the future, development will only be allowed within these renewable energy zones. Auctions will be held for RES capacity, and developers will be granted capacity based on their renewable energy zone access bids to connect their projects onto the grid. So rather than flippantly building transmission, what we're doing here really is looking at the most actionable and most cost-effective projects throughout the grid, getting the public/private funds to fund, these fairly capital-intensive augmentations that are taking place, and making sure that orderly development in a way that maximizes bang for the buck gets done in terms of wind, solar, and storage in a way that optimizes not just production, but also system security as a whole. So the very first initiative, Renewable Energy Zone Initiative, was this one here, the Central West Orana Renewable Energy Zone. Just that little blob there to give you guys an example is 3,500 megawatts of solar, wind, and storage. So it's pretty significant, but that only covers off 1/3 of Liddell being the next coal-fired power station that's retiring. It only covers 1 unit or 1/3 of that power station's capacity once you adjust for capacity factors. So one of these reses, you need about 3 of these reses to cover each retiring large coal-fired power station in the country. So moving forward, just wanted to give you guys an overview of who's sort of doing what in storage and how storage differs in Australia relative to the States. I think one of the really beneficial things that the States does really well is procurement mandates. So if you look at California, utilities are forced to procure X percentage or X number of megawatts from storage. It also chooses which technologies gets compensated. So if you look at CAISO in California, 4-hour storage and above only gets resource adequacy credits, which is the same thing as to say gets paid capacity payments. In Australia, there are no procurement targets whatsoever. The market is 100% competitive. So if you're a storage developer, you are getting paid purely from the markets. It is entirely up to you to get a tolling agreement, whether that's with an utility, a retailer, or a corporate. That's 100% entirely up to you with no mandates in place. So in a way, we're actually quite a bit more conservative than the States in the sense that we are not pre-picking winners. We are not cherry-picking technologies to favor. We are literally just making the grid a more orderly place under which one can invest whatever technology they choose to invest, provided that it's procured via a capacity auction mechanism under the renewable energy zone framework that we talked about a slide ago. So in terms of batteries, yeah, I think this slide is probably a little bit outdated, and it just references storage that has already been built. So quite a bit has been built in the last couple of years. Ours are under construction here and not really shown here. But talking about storage a little bit as well, just in terms of the role that voluntary demand plays into this. So what we're seeing is a incredible degree of contracting sophistication and innovation that's going on, whereby customers used to take supply on an intermittent basis. We're seeing more and more customers ask for sculpted or firm supply options. meaning give me a peak shape or some other structure that is firm in nature and leverages storage plus renewables to come up with a shape that is firm in nature and 100% renewable. So for instance, just the other day during customer discussions, we were asked to come up with 100% around the clock renewable shape. The way we do that is by combining wind, solar, and storage, and oversizing those components relative to the customer's desires. But yeah, I think storage has really enabled creativity in contracting and has really backstopped a lot of RE 100 and voluntary procurement customers, such as the big tech guys in Seattle and California, big supermarkets, the Walmarts of the world. I think everyone is looking to green the supply chain, and they're looking to do so by leveraging clever structures to manage their typically flat load exposure. So if you think of a data center, for instance, data centers have been experiencing incredible amounts of growth driven by the work from home revolution and the very fact we're here today on Zoom. That demand has increased 2 or 3-fold over the last couple of years, as I understand, and commensurately, the amount of green energy that's being procured on a voluntary basis has also gone through the roof. And storage is playing a critical role in making sure that renewables can be molded in terms of load shaping into the desired offtake supply shape that these large voluntary purchasers looking for clean renewable energy are looking for. Talk a little bit more about hydrogen here and how hydrogen development is changing, projected to change over the years to come. So hydrogen electrolysis is really being effectively combined with renewable energy zones, and hydrogen zones are being overlapped with renewable energy development zones so that middle of the day curtailment, if any, can be co-optimized with hydrogen electrolysis so that excess middle of the day solar, to use a technology as an example, isn't spilled, but is in fact used to produce something of materiality and of worth for the hydrogen owner. So there's 23 different hydrogen production sites strewn around the country, some of which in South Australia. This is actually meant to be in Tasmania, in Queensland, and in the Northern Territory, as well as Western Australia, can be exported to countries in Asia and more broadly elsewhere around the world. The first hydrogen export actually in the world was just shipped out of Queensland 2 or 3 weeks ago. So this hydrogen revolution really is starting to take off. And it's being propelled 100% by renewable energy in this country. So, just talking a little bit about economic challenges again that we face as an industry. If we look at some price curves here and how price curves are changing through time, as you can see, whilst the duck curve was a lot less steep in 2019, as you step forward through time, the duck curve actually goes down quite a bit to almost reaching negative prices. However, as you get to 2040, this comes right back up and prices come right back up again. The reason that is happening on a projected basis, and I'm just picking New South Wales here as a region of choice, the reason this is happening is 100% because of projected electrification, growth of EVs and hydrogen once again. So what we are seeing in the industry is that for a developer to prosper in a duck curve heavy region, you really do need to have a hedge against whatever technology is decreasing in terms of revenues through time. So if I'm a solar owner, I'm making $80 per megawatt hour in 2019 on average, or thereabouts. But by 2035, that's probably dropping down to $25 per megawatt hour on average. So what we're seeing is as the duck curve deepens, the amount of energy arbitrage that can be extrapolated through storage increases linearly. So in order for anyone to sort of benefit these days in a falling market with a duck curve, you really do need to have storage be a central core focus of your offering, combined with solar in order to make an economic return in a scenario where renewables are really forging to the front of the power grid. It is very difficult these days to be in a solar heavy node or region where prices are dropping and just relying on those revenues to make money. You really do need to make money through some other way, and the way that that's achieved really is through the spikes, the price spikes at the end of the day or early in the morning, which could also happen pretty often. So the days of standalone solar and probably standalone wind as well are probably counted in this country. Looking at California as an example, and more recently in PJM as well, there's in ERCOT, there's a lot of storage activity that's starting to pick up in the States. They have been primarily driven out by utility procurement mandates, but if you look at ERCOT pricing curves, for instance, there is a case to be made for 100% merchant storage coming to play very soon in the country, in that particular power pool. So moving forward, what we plan on doing is to really focus on structured products, which can be marketed at a premium. One can no longer focus on single technology, whether that's standalone PV or wind. You really do need to think about how do you diversify your risk away from being faced with declining prices. We've even looked at hydrogen on sites to manage energy spillage. So your use cases and the sophistication with which you need to operate in a deeply renewable grid is becoming increasingly more complex. Things are becoming a lot more difficult from an engineering and co-optimization and trading and dispatch point of view. And just getting a connection agreement is becoming a lot more challenging as system security ratios and the reliability of the grid itself becomes less favorable as synchronous generators are exiting. And then just talking about turning the page, we talk a little bit here about I guess truly audacious renewable energy projects that we're seeing take place here in Australia. Again, it's anyone's guess whether this will actually be successful, but again, we focus here on jobs creation and how the green energy transition can be something that's positive and cost effective, both from a consumer point of view, but also from the point of view of a government's looking to make tax revenue and money along the way. So the Sun Cable project is, I would argue, one of the most audacious projects in the world. It's recently been upgraded to include 14,000 megawatts of solar and 33,000 megawatt hours of storage, and aims to install a cable from Darwin here in the Northern Territory through Indonesia to finally reach Singapore, which is a 2,400 mile, just under 2,400 mile distance of cables. It would, of course, be the world's longest underwater sea cable through a seabed zone that is obviously known for large earthquakes, such as the big Sumatra earthquake tsunami that killed a whole bunch of people in 2004 and 2005. Don't remember the year exactly, but yeah, I mean, 14,000 megawatts of solar, 33,000 megawatt hours of storage, exported through a ridiculously long and complex cable. To give you guys an idea, they're literally building factories here in Indonesia, cabling factories, to be able to service cabling ships that are going to be going through the area, because the world's capacity of cabling exceeds the demands that this one project will require. So this one project will require so much cabling, high voltage DC cabling, that factories are being built along the way just to service this project. It's going to be a 10-year build out timeframe with an early 2033 COD, commercial operations date, for this project. So some really, really interesting things are coming about as a result of the energy transition here. Some true audacious levels of innovation are happening, resulting in export of hydrogen, export of clean electricity to a foreign country, all of which really are combining to benefit workers locally, and to ultimately prove the policy naysayers on certain sides of the aisle wrong. The economy is currently running at a record low unemployment rate. Renewable energy is playing a significant role in hiring, in having those new jobs be advertised and new people hired into the industry. So yeah, so it's been a pretty interesting last couple of years here in terms of how businesses are changing, regulators are changing, and how projects are coming about. So I guess just wrapping it up, just checking for time here, probably a little bit early, but just wrapping it up here. I guess similarly to the States, the main thing that, in my opinion, from a renewable energy point of view, the main characteristic that the US and Australia share is the tyranny of distance, whereby in the States, the bulk of your solar resources runs through the Rust Belt, through the central states, through the plains here, but the population centers are much closer to the water on the West Coast and the East Coast. So I guess, you know, thinking of Australia and thinking about what this US needs to do is to really, you know, contemplate how it plans on committing itself to building out capacity infrastructure from where the natural resources are, where solar radiation is, and where wind resources are, back to the load centers. So Australia having 25 million people in terms of population in the States, with 320 or whatever it is these days, if we're spending $30–40 billion here, it's probably, you know, over $500 billion of capacity investments that's needed in the States on a population adjusted basis to build out sufficient capacity to be able to meet the load and demand requirements from the population centers on the coasts. There is a lot of non-trivial challenges that cannot be met with just money. There is a lot of, you know, rights of ways, easements, land issues that need to be contemplated, environmental issues that need to be contemplated. These projects take, you know, a very long time to work through, and most critically coordinate at the community engagement level. So yes, the transition is unfortunately slow. It does take a long time, but every journey starts with a single step. And through time, I think hopefully the States ends up in a similar place as to where we are here, where despite the negativity and the non-cohesive policies, I think declining costs speak for themselves, and industry trends. The market eventually wins out over policies, and the revolution here is moving forward with or without policy. It's moving forward purely on an economic basis, but that is indeed resulting in a lot of technical challenges that will have costs and do require policy and orchestration to be fixed in the long run. So that's really all I had here. Hopefully that wasn't too disjointed and all over the shop for everybody. Just wanted to open it up for any questions that I might be able to answer.
Thank you, Leo. That was really very eye-opening. Did not know much of what you just presented in terms of what's happening in Australia. So I guess the students, I'd like to ask if they have questions to please either put it in the chat or speak up. I mean, I can start with some questions. I had some while I was listening in, but I would like the students to have the opportunity to sort of chime in. The number that you had mentioned. Oh, is there anyone asking a question?
I don't see anybody yet. So
okay. Sorry. I was going to ask you, Leo, about the 6 times consistent, the gap that you mentioned in terms of the renewables versus the coal retirements. Is that number consistent with what you've seen in other parts of the world, or is that Australia targeting its own sort of goals?
No, I think that's Australia targeting its own sort of goals, and that really does have a lot to do with hydrogen. So, I mean, we're showing demand doubling here, at least doubling. If you look at this graph here, where is the demand graph? Yeah, I mean, we're basically, I know the data. I mean, we're showing demand doubling here under step change. And if you look at hydrogen superpower, I mean, we're literally looking at a 5x or 6x factor in demand growth via electrification. Electrification really is the #1 trend that is driving the growth of renewables. So it's not about just replacing exiting generation. It is about overbuilding renewables to account for that soon to come electrification from hydrogen projects and elsewhere. To give you Tasmania is probably the best example of that. Tasmania, small place, 500,000 inhabitants, load of about 2,000 megawatts in terms of demand, but there's 6,000 megawatts worth of hydrogen projects here. So literally the region should everything go ahead and advance to final investment decision, the totality of the hydrogen projects in the Tasmanian region will result in the demand in the pool in that region increasing by a factor of 3x in the next 10 to 15 years. So it is very much Australia specific. You would probably expect to see in other markets, you would expect to see this ratio here. Where are we? This ratio here be sort of 3x, with 3x being the capacity factor, dispatch factor of solar and wind the average of the two relative to a 100% capacity factor coal-fired power station. So I'd expect that to be 3, not 6.
Right. And in terms of storage?
Yeah, storage is a funny one. So if you look at, and I've seen this on virtual power plants, for instance, if you look at a closed-ended system, an islanded system with very little need for grid connection, getting to 80% renewables is pretty easy, and you can do that without a lot of storage. Getting to 90% renewables is pretty easy. You can do that without a lot of storage. Getting to 95% renewables in any system requires you to have about the same level of storage as your demand is. But once you go past 95% renewables in any system, in any grid, whether that's a virtual power plant or a whole market, a whole ISO, you actually start to need about 3, 4, 5x more storage to go from 95% renewables to 100% renewables. So I think, you know, the last 5% become extremely, extremely expensive to achieve in any system in terms of being clean. So, I mean, where I think Australia will land, and for that matter, where I think everyone else in the world is likely to land, is unfortunately not 100% renewable power grid, but really one that's probably 95% renewable or thereabouts, with the balance of carbon abatements coming from elsewhere in the economy, whether that's in the transport sector or farming sector or elsewhere. Yeah, it's extremely costly to run a 100% renewable system. The amount of storage you would need would probably be 5x or 4x of this if you were targeting 100%. Our economy-wide targets are net zero by 2050. So that doesn't necessarily imply 100% zero. It means net zero, and it does mean economy-wide. So we are not showing ourselves that we're not seeing the power generation industry being 100% clean, but really closer to 95%, which is what would really drive the amount of storage build out that we're seeing here.
Great. We've got a couple of questions in the chat, Leo. The first one, I'll read it, is coal energy will be phased out between 2030 with terminal date of about 2042. Within the same period, the Sun project will be on stream. How will Australia manage both without transmission hiccups?
That's a really good question. Thanks for that question. So the way that will be managed is actually pretty simple, and it's something I should have touched on, but I didn't. The grid is only connected. So there are actually 3 grids in Australia. The national energy market is the eastern markets that stretches from South Australia into Victoria, down to Tasmania, and then up the coast to Queensland. Northern Territory over here is actually a separate standalone grid in of itself, and Western Australia is a separate standalone grid as well. So the Sun project is going to basically have its own standalone everything and be disconnected from the Eastern markets grid and from the Northern Territory grid. So the specific routing has changed a couple of times here. It has done so. It has changed so because of grid coordination questions with respect to the transmission facilities and infrastructure that are currently in place here in the Northern Territory grid. But yeah, it is envisaged that this thing is not going to be orchestrated or coordinated with any other grids. It really is just going to be this, you know, forget the footprint, but it's something like 120,000 acres or something extremely, extremely huge that is being used here in the middle of the desert, nowhere just covered in solar and storage to address this. So the answer is it's not going to be coordinated. If there is any degree of coordination, it's going to be relatively small. Private wires totaling about 500 miles are being built out to connect the projects down here deep in the red center to Darwin, which is on the coast, which is where you would finally reach water, and the cabling would connect upwards towards Singapore. So very little coordination needed is the answer.
Okay, the next question is, what would you say is holding renewable energy back in Australia financially? Are there enough companies that are financing it?
I think, funnily enough, I think the thing that really holds things back here. So I think, we're not really held back here, but to the extent that we are held back because of investor confidence, I would say. Investors obviously like the policy settings in the investment climate to be set in stone, and all surprises are generally bad. We do have a couple of items in the market which are investor unfriendly. Marginal loss factors are one, to give you an example. So a generator who builds an asset in a given location and delivers energy to the regional reference node is paid only for the loss adjusted portion of energy that reaches the regional reference node. And those loss factors change quite a bit from year to year. And as more generation comes in, loss factors can decrease through time, impacting on investor confidence. So it's actually a really good point that you're raising, because in the past, we really worried about getting access to the grid, and then we just bid negatively, or we bid zero, and we waited for a big project, often thermal in nature, to bid positively, and the marginal cost would benefit everybody who was underneath in the dispatch merit order. In the future, with no thermal generators in play, with everyone now retired, what you have left is a pool of all $0 marginal cost generators. So it begs the question, where does the money come from? You're no longer behaving in the market or participating in a market where you expect yourself to be deep in the merit order and dispatched each and every time, because there are a lot more less cost-effective generators that are setting the prices. You're now in a market where everybody looks and smells the same, in the sense that everyone is $0 marginal cost. So there are some serious questions around policy questions around whether an energy-only market like we have in Australia is the adequate framework for a $0 marginal cost market. Should it be more a capacity market like it is in the States? Just about everywhere in the States except for ERCOT, really. Or should it be something else? And protecting access to the grid is also super important. So you can't, obviously, an investor clearly is afraid of being in the $0 marginal cost market. There are policy changes that are being talked about to address that very topic. But I guess the second one is coming back to the access regime in the renewable energy zones that I talked about. You don't want to be sitting there as a generator with a loss factor of 1, and then another competing generator gets enacted next door to you, and your loss factor goes down by 10%, and you're getting paid on only 90% of the generation you produce. So protection and a walk away from the well and truly open access regime that we have here is another topic of concern and discussion here locally.
Right. So another question is, do you see the percentage of hydrogen in natural gas system continuing to increase beyond the 15-20% that you had mentioned?
So that's another hotly debated question locally here, and the answer to that lies in it's a surprising answer actually. So because of the calorific value of hydrogen, hydrogen is actually a lot more combustible, a lot more powerful than natural gas is because of its calorific value. So unless the very appliances in your home were to change, unless your stove was to change, for instance, you actually can't exceed much more than 20% hydrogen without actually changing the appliances themselves, because believe it or not, there's calorific limits to the fuel that is in the stove, for instance. So if you have too much hydrogen, you can actually explode your stove in a distribution system. So the answer is probably not, unless the very appliances we've come to rely on are also substituted and changed to account for the change in the feedstock that's coming through the pipes in the distribution system from into your house. It's actually a really interesting problem.
Right. Is hydrogen fuel used wide scale in any applications today, or is Australia aiming to convert current processes like heating to hydrogen to use this fuel?
Well, I think all sorts of use cases are currently up for grabs, if you will, for hydrogen. I guess hydrogen is projected to become increasingly more affordable through time as economies of scale in the manufacturing of electrolysis takes hold, and the electrolysis kit becomes more affordable in the same way that we saw learning rates bring down the cost of solar and wind over the last decade or so. The same is expected to happen to hydrogen. So as the cost of hydrogen decreases, we expect more and more use cases for hydrogen to become cost effective. So, I mean, a great example is, probably, aviation. Aviation is something that will probably take 15, 20 years to become cost effective. But heavy vehicles or other fleets that rely on diesel, which is pretty expensive, are probably cost effective now. Hydrogen is probably currently today, clean hydrogen, at about $4 per MMBTU. It's pretty expensive right now. So there's only a selected few cases that are in the money. Heavy vehicles comes to mind. Mining and explosives come to mind via ammonia. So to give you guys an example, there's mining companies here that are creating and sponsoring whole hydrogen projects, because the ammonia that can be made as a byproduct of hydrogen electrolysis can be converted into explosives, and those explosives are 1/3 the cost of buying TNT. So even, and you need TNT mining for obvious reasons. So even today's expensive, by relative terms, hydrogen feedstock at $4.50 is relatively affordable as compared to, say, TNT for the mining ammonia use case. So there's a lot of really interesting applications that no doubt will come about through time. Several more that haven't been thought up or thought about in detail will certainly come about. But I think the low-hanging fruits is definitely starting to be used locally. And what I would personally expect is that I think as better practices take hold throughout different industries, some of these use cases are going to expand above and beyond just Australia and more broadly into elsewhere in the world as well. I think methanol is another interesting one. You see methanol be used a lot in shipping use cases. And that's an example that is really being driven from the shipping industry overseas and the demand reaching Australia rather than the other way around. So I think the hydrogen evolution is one of the most interesting things that we'll see in the next decade or so, coupled with the growth of renewables.
Great. We've got one more question is regarding the sun cable, which is the graphic you have up. Are you showing nuclear as part of the generation mix?
No nuclear, no nuclear in the generation mix here. Lots of historical and deeply political reasons for that, but Australia is nuclear free. It has instead debatable whether it was the right choice or the wrong choice, focused on using coal and gas, which are both abundant natural resources, in lieu of using nuclear, noting that uranium is also an abundant natural resource here, and Australia is also a big uranium exporter in the world, but for many reasons, it chose not to focus on nuclear.
Interesting. Just as a point of curiosity, do you know what the price tag for the sun cable project is?
Estimates, I mean, it's in the tens of billions. I think last time I looked at, it was somewhere between 12 to 16 billion.
Wow.
So it's a big project.
Yeah, yeah. Very ambitious. Okay, more questions. Does anybody want to sort of speak up and ask a question? All right. Well, I guess in the interest of time, which you generously gave us some back, I guess we can end the seminar here. And again, a very deep thank you to Leo for joining us from Australia very early in the morning to do this presentation. At least for me, very intriguing and an eye-opening discussion about the sort of future renewable energy growth in Australia and all the sort of ambitious plans that are in play. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for getting up so early, Leo.
That's all right. See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Shalini.
You're welcome.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you for attending, everyone.